We begin today by acknowledging the sovereign custodians of the lands where we live respectively, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nations, and the traditional unceded territories of the Qualicum and Snownoas First Nations. In so-called Australia and Canada, First Nations, Inuit and Métis continue to assert sovereignty, self-determination and justice in the face of hundreds of years of genocide, land theft and broken promises. We acknowledge this as a way to offer our respect to the past and present elders of these lands, and through them to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, to all First Nations, Inuit and Métis, and to country itself. We know that fish are in trouble. Across diverse watersheds, habitats and geographies, scientists and Indigenous knowledge keepers are raising the alarm about fish declines across the planet. For environmental humanities scholars committed to understanding the myriad relations between humans and environments and the impacts of anthropogenic violence perpetuated through colonialism and resource capitalism, there are questions on how to attend to the scale and intensity of this destruction, not only in terms of how we approach it, but how we narrate and make sense of it. A risk in environmental scholarship and policy, particularly also within the environmental humanities, is the instrumentalization of these ecological hotspots, which are used to further academic theorization on what the world is and what it is becoming. In this talk, we engage Zoe's idea of an environmental kin study to understand why and how we might come to restore fish in ways that do not reiterate the same dispossessions that we are trying to counteract. For us, a kin study always begins from a disposition of listening. Listening, which draws on my work, refers to a non-prescriptive and self-reflexive embodied practice that requires each of us to understand how we are in relation with each other and the world, the legacies we bring, and what responsibilities we bear within these relations. Listening is not simply an oral act. It is a dedication to sensing, attuning, and noticing with an objective toward dismantling the white supremacist ways of thinking and knowing we uphold. Listening is also moving towards an understanding of what substantive action we can take toward the material return and regeneration of Indigenous lands and resources. The ideas we are thinking with and practicing here are not new. They are not uniquely ours, and we want to show how they emerge from long lineages, communities, and lifetimes of consideration and ways of being. Based on our respective ongoing collaborations in the Canadian prairies and the Pacific, in this talk we introduce how listening to fish helps us to conceive of how we might intervene in the current dominant forces at play. The environmental humanities have long shared a concern with the ethical and careful approach to encounters and connections between the human and the non-human. Central to the environmental humanities is a gathering together of eclectic and interdisciplinary methods to better understand nature and culture, how these are made as distinct from one another, and how this distinction is maintained and perpetuated. Increasingly, scholars have come to understand the impossibility of this distinction, and particularly drawing on Indigenous thought, have sought to address the centuries of epistemic racism and violence integral to the Anglo-European cleaving of the world. Within this has been work that emphasizes the co-constituency and interdependence of humans and ecosystems as a way to move toward more liberatory ways of being, and this is where environmental kin studies situates itself. Kin studies, as we see it, is an unfolding relational method for attending to the nuanced and particular effects of ecocide, which is capable of holding the complexities of material and spiritual life, experienced by people living in ecological hotspots. In From Case Study to Kin Study, a citational politics for studying environmental violence, Zoe speaks of the need for, and I quote, thoughtful, careful, and plural hyperlocal ethnographies to counter the ways that the overwhelmingly white, Eurocentric academy and global policy discourses of global warming erase the local, specific experiences of devastation faced by marginalized communities, end quote. This idea of kin study draws on the scholarship of philosophers including Kim Tolbear, Robert Alexander Innes, Vanessa Watts, Leroy Littlebear, Erica Violet Lee, Elmer Ghostkeeper, and others. Through our work together, we are continually expanding the underpinning tenets of what constitutes environmental kin studies and why it is a crucial counterpoint to what is broadly used within the social sciences and environmental humanities as case studies. For us, kin studies speak to a concern with the ways that specific places in Canada and the Pacific have become talking points and data sheds for scholars in the global north and in the Colonial Academy as they seek to understand global climate and environmental crisis. We have observed that places like the tar sands in Alberta or the Marshall Islands in the Pacific have become case types of the Anthropocene, case studies of destruction mobilized in myriad academic, art, and policy endeavors by scholars who may have never visited these locations, let alone spoken to anyone from these places. Kin studies arises from the premise that the case study, as used in environmental humanities and social science research, law, and policy, is inherently predicated on a separation of place from thought. While there are many important uses of the case study, as is evident with the history of Indigenous mobilisations of Aboriginal case law in Canada and in so-called Australia as elsewhere, we want to flag some of the dangers inherent in the ubiquitous environmental case study as it is currently employed in eco-disaster narratives. The case study in Western society is designed to travel, to be applied in contexts far removed from the initial incident. This separation gives rise to universalization and enables people to draw upon place and people without attending to reciprocal responsibilities to those places that are invoked in the work, or those places that have informed very particular understandings of an issue or challenge. Foundational to kin studies is a centering of place and land in how we inhabit and make sense of ourselves and our surroundings. Place and land emerge through the relations that nurture and story them. As such, they are deeply bound in time and space, with specific knowledges, specific beings, and specific histories. Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe scholar Vanessa Watts unfolds an Indigenous conception of ontoepistemology rooted in her own knowing and being from the Great Lakes region of North America, stating that, and I quote, "Habitats and ecosystems are better understood as societies from an Indigenous point of view, meaning that they have ethical structures, interspecies treaties and agreements, and further their ability to interpret, understand, and implement. Non-human beings are active members of society. Not only are they active, they also directly influence how humans organize themselves into that society. Human thought and action are therefore derived from a literal expression of particular places and historical events." End quote. This resonates in so-called Australia, and I quote, "within a Yolngu Indigenous ontology, in which, write the Yolngu and non-Indigenous authors collaborating with Baraka country, quote, animals, rocks, winds, tides, emotions, spirits, songs, and humans speak. They all have language and knowledge and law. They all send messages, communicate with each other. Country is the Aboriginal English word which encompasses this vibrant and sentient understanding of space-place, which becomes bounded through its interconnectivity. Country and everything it encompasses is an active participant in the world, shaping and creating it." End quote. In Pacific cultures, it is also impossible to separate land from oceans, people, plants, animals, and spiritual worlds. Tongan poet and scholar Kanngieser Thaman writes that, quote, "Pacific notions of identity tend to emphasize the environment in its totality, a concept for which the English term land is grossly inadequate." End quote. This is why we need to approach studies of place and land with deep care. In Fijian, Itauke, states Una Isi Nabobo Baba, the word vanua denotes, quote, "land and place, everything on it and in it, all flora and fauna as well as waterways, oceans, mountains, and forests. Land is of physical, social, and spiritual significance to people." End quote. Within Pacific conceptions of environment, affirms Barnaban Ikiribus and African-American anthropologist Katerina Teawa, the ocean is a, quote, "corporeal and psychic relational vehicle," end quote. And quote, land serves to teach about the spatiality of life in contrast to or in concert with the sea, end quote.
In kin studies, it is imperative to approach land and place as co-constitutive with human and non-human beings, spirits, atmospheres, and people. It is necessary for what Bawakar country and its Yolngu and non-Indigenous authors call co-becoming. Acknowledging this requires scholars studying environmental issues to address the importance of maintaining ethical and reciprocal kin-centric relationships with land and place, and all the co-constituents thereof. In advocating for a kin-centric approach, we need to ensure we do not romanticize the concept of kinship, so often central to the ethnographic and extractive gaze of anthropologists as they studied Indigenous peoples in many homelands. Drawing inspiration from Tarahumara scholar Enrique Salmon's articulations of kin-centric environmental studies praxis, we articulate formulations of kinship that explicitly center the radical possibilities of relationality in the face of refusal of colonial capitalist orderings of the world. In this formation of kinship, we argue for a concept resonant with what Rebecca Louise Carter conceptualizes as a restorative kinship in her own work on Black women's kinship and community grieving and rebuilding in post-Katrina New Orleans. The kinship we are working with is explicitly grounded in the material relations between humans, lands, waters, and other realities that we navigate at this juncture of inequality and injustice across the earth. Drawing on the instructive work of Linda Tuhiwai Smith, we are also careful not to recreate mystical portrayals of kinship, environment, and relationships, often articulated unknowingly within contemporary discourses of human and non-human relations in the Anglo-European Academy. As she reminds us, quote, "It may be those qualities that make me skeptical or cautious about the mystical, misty-eyed discourse that is sometimes employed by Indigenous peoples to describe our relations with the land and the universe. I believe that our survival as peoples has come from our knowledge of our context, our environment, not from some active beneficence of our Earth Mother. We had to know to survive. We had to work out ways of knowing. We had to predict, to learn and reflect. We had to preserve and protect. We had to defend and attack. We had to be mobile. We had to have social systems which enabled us to do these things, and we still have to do these things." End quote. One area that kin studies manifests in both our work is through our interactions with fish. This comes in part through following the counsel of Blackfoot scholar Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who has written, presented, and advised extensively on questions of Blackfoot metaphysics, science, education, and governance. Over the years, including during a talk that he gave at the Congress of Humanities in Calgary, Alberta in 2016, he has asked audiences to consider the following question. Quote, "The fish, for instance, nobody's talked about the fish in this Congress, not that I know of. But the fish has been around, think about it, way before the dinosaurs, way before the Neanderthals, way before our time. The fish is still around. I wonder what scientific formula the fish has discovered. We should ask the fish. They've survived." End quote. When I share this quote in my talks, someone will inevitably ask, "So how do you talk to the fish?" I only recently realized that those audience members have been asking the wrong question. Asking is not always about talking. It's not so much about how to talk to the fish, perhaps, but it's how to listen to them. Listening begins from the specificities of relations that inform and constitute place, and that tie place to its people, its power, and its autonomy. This was crucial to how I began my fish work. In May 2018, my late stepfather, Wayne Emerson Roberts, passed away. He had spent his entire adult lifetime with the fish along waterways in the eastern slopes of the Alberta Rocky Mountains, and well into the parklands of the Red Deer and North Saskatchewan rivers in central Alberta, among many others. In the weeks and months after his death, I began to sort through every publication of his that I could track down. with the help of an archivist who set up a Dropbox of his writings for me out of extreme kindness. I dove into his research as a way to grieve, and what I came to understand in those months was just how visionary and expansive Wayne's life's work had been, though he moved with extreme humility and humor while alive. When he was 16, Wayne began studying bull trout in the riverways he was familiar with in central Alberta. Within 20 years, by 1983, the year that I was born, he had methodically documented an alarming decline in the species' distribution and numbers throughout large sections of central Alberta. He did this by spending time at the water's edge, paying attention to the fish, observing them, fly fishing, and tramping through the woods and along creeks and streams to familiarize himself with their habitats. He also, according to his own account, spoke with fishermen and anglers and gathered his own ethnographic data that gave him insight into historical distribution of the fish back to the early 20th century. However, even with this important work and the work of many tireless advocates in the province, it would take another 38 years before the fish was formally listed as threatened under federal law. To help understand how Wayne could quite literally peer into the future before his academic colleagues, it is instructive to come back to thinking more closely with how we move towards seeking consent from water and fish. How can we seriously attend to Leroy Little Bear's instructions to ask the fish what they think? Working across worlds, across interspecies intelligences and sensing, and across the onto-epistemological breakages and ruptures inherent in the last 600 years of colonial capitalist, white supremacist universalism, Anglo-European societies have convinced the world that there is no way to directly learn from the fish what they think, unless it is through invasive and empirical testing upon them as scientific specimens, as fish stocks, as animals without philosophy or stories or legal orders of their own. There is a huge risk, however, in Western actors responding to calls to decolonize, as Leon Musavi shows, and as Chisomo Kalinga emphasizes, quote, decolonial studies has been gentrified by global North academics, end quote. In kin studies, we begin from listening and attunement. Listening is what is called forth when Cree and Métis legal orders center reciprocal responsibilities to all relations, be they human or more than human. It also resonates with what Dr. Miriam Rose and Gunmar, an Aboriginal activist, scholar, and artist of the Ingat Githyameri language group, speaks about as Dadiri, or deep listening. Attunement means to tune into, to find intersections of harmonization and also discordance across difference, without forcing assimilation. Listening is the cultivation of an attentiveness. It is a responsiveness to what is there, what is here right now. Listening in kin studies is not a final thing. It is not about saying I listen as though listening is where it ends. Listening is a starting point that allows for a suspension of what we think we know. It is a pause that might intervene in the rush to conclusion, expertise, and action.
In our work specifically, listening is a practice to understand how I am in place and what I bring when I listen, interpret, and create knowledge. Stolo philosopher Dylan Robinson writes that when placed in the framework of enacting accountability to material decolonization rather than simply a statement thereof, an understanding of listening positionality can help to deconstruct the homogeneous and normative assumptions underpinning settler colonizer narratives by showing settler positionality itself as, quote, a stratified and intersectional process, end quote. For Robinson, a kind of listening that oscillates across layers of positionality can, quote, begin through detailing very specific aspects of one's positionality and then identifying the ways in which those aspects allow or foreclose upon certain ways of looking, kinds of touch, or listening hunger, end quote. This, he notes, quote, is very challenging and detailed self-work to undertake, end quote, but it is necessary to conceiving of listening toward anti-racist, anti-colonialist, queer and feminist practices. Listening in this way is necessarily hard and slow. For me, listening to fish in the Pacific means arriving at a place and understanding who I am in relation to where I arrive. I have to be sensitive to and navigate how the different ways I inhabit the world and what is associated with those identities come to speak to one another or get made meaning of in the specific place I am coming into. As a white European Australian researcher, as a transgender and disabled person, a parent and carer, a precarious scholar, an artist, an ethnographer, it means asking, do I come as a guest, a stranger, am I kin or family? Is my presence invited? What are my intentions here? Listening asks me to be present in how my body moves and shifts the environment through relation and how the environment shifts me. When I arrive somewhere, I introduce myself and let the place know who I am, where I come from and what my intentions there are. I ask the sea, the fish, the sharks, the crabs and crustaceans, the seaweed, the shrimp, the creatures I can see and those that I cannot. Permission to be there, to listen, and to turn on my recording device. Then I wait. Consent, as I interpret it, can be a long time in forthcoming, if at all. Unlike seeking consent from humans where there are specific methods to follow, seeking consent from place is harder, and I draw all my instruction from collaborators and Pacific colleagues. I have learnt never to assume that I have consent to be somewhere, particularly on Indigenous land that has been violated by European colonizers. After my introduction, I wait until I feel something resonant in my body, a deep sense of how and where to move, if at all. Without feeling this, I do not do anything. Over a long time, I've come to understand what I perceive permission might feel like and what being unwanted might feel like. Permission, for me personally, feels like a huge swell of invitation and enveloping. Being unwanted feels like a magnetic revulsion, a feeling of wrongness. Attunement like this is entirely dependent on a commitment to waiting for an answer. There is a complex, layered and nuanced dance between people, place, animals and spirits in this work. In 2018, I was invited by a Fijian marine biologist from the University of the South Pacific to visit a village she had been working with, where a mangrove restoration project was taking place. The project began in 2015 in Nazalai, on the river delta, one of several communities chosen by the Fijian Ministry of Fisheries and Forestry to take part in the management project. The aim was to rehabilitate coastal and mangrove wetlands critical to the communities living there through supporting subsistence marine life, including gari, or mud crabs, mana, mud lobsters, and muthi, shrimps. The project sought to engender community care and build ecosystem resources by expanding traditional knowledge and skill sharing. I was nervous about what I could bring to this encounter, because while I was afforded access as a white foreign researcher, I was not affiliated with the ministry and I did not bring substantial research funds or connections to ongoing capital. I brought the headman the traditional offering of yagona and paid for petrol and boat hire while he eyed my sound recording equipment with some curiosity. As we motored to the mangroves where the fish were, he told me about the process of the project and what scientists had reported back in terms of marine repopulation. He asked what my equipment would tell them, and I told him that I really didn't know. When we anchored, I sat for a while in stillness trying to connect to the water, while being acutely aware of the headman's gaze on me. I dropped the microphones into the water and immediately registered faint grunts and groans amongst the pops of snapping shrimp. I didn't know if the sounds were fish or frogs, or the rubbing of rope against the hull of the boat. After a few minutes, the headman asked to listen, and I handed him the headphones. For the next hour, he sat crouched over with his hands to his ears. I had no idea what he was listening to or what sense he was making of it at the time. As time went on, I realized that whatever he was hearing was telling him a story that was not for me. And actually, I ended up realizing afterwards that I had not pressed the record button, so I have never been able to hear what he was listening to throughout that period of time. What to me was indecipherable was for him an evidencing of life that spoke of a long and ongoing regeneration. When he finally handed the headphones back, he said to me something like, "The fish are back again, I can hear them down there." While I had come to listen for myself, those sounds were for him to hear and make a story of, not for me. I simply did not have the ability, and nor was it my place, to interpret what was so integral to his world. The ways that listening as a practice plays out require a constant reflexivity that is aware of one's own conditions and constraints across these shifting positionalities. I Kiribati scholar and poet Te Viriki Terero said to me when I asked him about the importance of listening, and I quote, "2 ears, 1 mouth. Don't talk too much. Learn to listen more. Not only to hear, but to be able to develop another thing, and that is to be able to interpret. These things are different. They occur at different levels. The hearing and the interpretation of the sound, it's very much part of our world," end quote. What Te Viriki's words cautioned me was to be aware of what I am hearing and to find ways to understand what the sounds and silences of places are telling me. In environmental kin studies, to listen and to be present to where attunement might arise is a way for us to respect the land and all those who inhabit it. As Baraka country and its Yolngu and non-Indigenous collaborators write, and I quote, "A methodology of attending means more than just listening deeply, though listening plays an important part. Attending means to listen, to feel and to act, to understand oneself differently, to care, to respond," end quote. Attunement, or tuning into, what is given to us shows me how much I don't know. As a settler-colonizer scholar, I am trained to be well versed in discourses and languages that universalize and reduce to quantifiable parts, and in doing so take away the expanse of what is incommensurable and unimaginable. The scale of ecocide and the loss of people and ecologies to capitalist brutalities exceed what we can comprehend, as do the flourishings and alliances, the being otherwise, the lives lived elsewhere and in ways that are unfamiliar and uncontained. Listening in kin studies asks us to tune into gaps and silences and soundings that run through everything. It invites us to become curious about where things resonate and to understand that we don't know, and we can't know, more than is ours. Angela Last writes that, especially within arts and academia, nature-based work will often want to, quote, reconnect people with the earth while ignoring their situatedness at sites of colonial trauma, end quote. It's imperative to remember that European colonization is driven by the need to know, claim, and take. Underpinning what Gurnpool scholar Aileen Morton Robinson calls the logic of the white possessive is a, quote, desire to invest in reproducing and reaffirming the nation-state's ownership, control, and domination, end quote. The academic and artistic white possessive is seen in the sense of entitlement to environments and peoples that whiteness is founded in. With this comes the demand for transparency. When we become attuned to environments, when we self-reflexively engage with the ways in which our bodies affect and are affected by environments, we might begin to challenge these demands. In kin studies, listening unsettles the logics of possession because it owns nothing and it is never certain. Listening is antithetical to novelty because there is no beginning or end. Sound moves, and in moving with it, invites humility because there are no definitive answers to be found. By practicing listening, we find our interdependencies. And this is critical to undoing what we think we know. Remaining open and curious about what we notice departs from the assertions that institutions want from us. It defies expertise and capture because you never really know. Through never really knowing, the push to extract and profit becomes much less present. What is foregrounded is how we comport ourselves in relation to what we hear. In much environmental writing, where invocation is done without relation, there is little sensitivity to the quality of placefulness. There is little attunement to the spiritual and sacred dimensions when lands and people are not sought permission from. The impacts of telling other people's and places' stories is not held in mind.
So what is fish restoring? In fish work, listening is the starting point for restoring. Listening, as we said, both allows us to come into relation with place and be with its specificities. The universal discourses adopted through Western environmental narratives are problematic. when they do not recognize that place and land are intrinsically shaped by relationships that are not replicable or interchangeable. When land is understood in this way, the sovereignty of its specificity is the point from which kin studies might proceed. This resonates with an orientation towards what Kanaka Maoli scholar Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua calls land-centered literacies, which, quote, include the ways Kanaka Iwi developed practices of reading the stars and other celestial bodies and events, offering chants in our own human language, and then observing and finding meaning in the responses of winds, rains, birds, waves, or stones, end quote. Bell Hooks writes that, quote, a powerful way we connect with a diverse world is by listening to the different stories we are told, end quote. Places tell stories. Restoring is a way to tend to place through story, which allows us to refuse to make generalizations. Stories are a foundational aspect of Indigenous philosophy, language, legal orders, and being. Drawing on the extensive, rich, and dynamic threads of many generations of Indigenous scholarship and advocacy on stories as method, we propose in our work an approach that we are calling fish restoring, which is to say, a mode of restoring fish habitats and relations through stories. So here we can return to Wayne's work. Once he had compiled his data, Wayne took a resolution forward to the 1983 Alberta Fish and Wildlife Association meeting in Edmonton. Responding to his extensive data, the organization passed a resolution to help the bull trout. By 1985, the Provincial Environment and Natural Resources Ministry had prepared a recovery plan for the species. Things were looking up. The province quickly implemented catch and release measures, which helped address the angling pressures that were contributing to the decline of the species, which in Wayne's opinion was the biggest threat to the species at that point. And this did help somewhat. However, this was not the whole picture. One of the biggest threats to native trout species in Alberta today is the confluence of extensive resource extraction, anthropogenic climate change, agriculture, backcountry recreational vehicle use. In other words, a variety of factors which are fragmenting bull trout habitat and altering the clear, cool, connected waters that bull trout, Athabasca rainbow trout, and West Slope cutthroat trout need to survive. With the benefits of catch and release clearly observable, the bull trout were still not out of trouble. By the early 1990s, Wayne was preparing documentation for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSAWIC, arguing that he had more than enough evidence already that the species was threatened. Scientists and bureaucrats in Alberta organized a bull trout task force and a series of bull trout conferences in the early 1990s. In an effort to raise awareness about bull trout decline, the province made bull trout the official provincial fish in 1994. South of the border, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed their bull trout populations as threatened in 1999. But it took another 20 years for Canada to follow suit by listing the Saskatchewan Nelson bull trout population as threatened in 2019, a full year after Wayne passed away. And by that time, the species had declined, according to former COSAWIC chair Dr. John Post, 30 to 50% in the prior 25 years. So what happened? The failure of imagination and the failure of fishy attunement of the revolving cast of settler academic and government policies that shaped how scientists, consultants, analysts, and corporate representatives were able to speak for the bull trout through Western governance and regulatory systems, in a sense, massively ill-equipped them for this work. They tried to save the bull trout in boardrooms and labs, rather than employing the attunement approach that someone like Wayne used at the water's edge. It's not that they didn't care about the bull trout. In fact, they cared deeply, but the tools they had available were inadequate to the job. So in short, the only way that Western governance knows to story bull trout decline is through the settler apocalyptic language of inevitability, formula graphs, and management. But someone like Wayne, fishing and listening for stories along those waterways back in his youth, knew that the fastest way to understand what scientific formula the fish had figured out, as Leroy Littlebear urges us to consider, was to spend time on the water. And not with electrofishing rods or environmental DNA tools or quotas and grants in mind, but with a curiosity for what is going on through and across the refraction of stories at the water's edge. Wayne understood the importance of a story that bends light and time, the kind of story that draws humans out of their comfort zone and throws you into the fish's world. It was Wayne who taught me how to restory the bull trout. Restoring is not a new concept. In fact, it is an implicit facet of Indigenous governance built and coded through stories here in North America. The stories that we tell shape and are shaped by relations and place. In working with our fish restoring approach, we gesture to similar concepts that have emerged through work that biologists and others have done through apprenticeships with Indigenous nations in many homelands. Kutcha Risling-Baldy, in her work on oral traditions and trickster stories in her homelands, writes, quote, "By rewriting and revitalizing, oral traditions and stories are able to unsettle the knowledge that we take for granted as universal and call into question ideas of objectivity, truth, and fact, some of the very building blocks of Western epistemologies." In her Storyscapes project, Cree Métis filmmaker and urban geographer Kamala Todd seeks to re-narrate the presence and history of Indigenous peoples in Vancouver in the 2000s, to shift understandings of belonging, memory, and collective responsibilities to and in place. In 25 Indigenous projects, Linda Tuhiwai Smith writes about the importance of storytelling. Stories, she says, are always relational. Quote, "The point is not that they simply tell a story or tell a story simply. New stories contribute to a collective story in which every Indigenous person has a place. For many Indigenous writers, stories are ways of passing down the beliefs and values of a culture in the hope that the new generations will treasure them and pass the story down further. The story and the storyteller both serve to connect the past with the future, one generation with the other, the land with the people, and the people with the story."
In working with restoring, we are trying to avoid the traps of contemporary, highly commodified Western storytelling, which emphasizes linearity, resolution, and relatability over difference, complexity, and openness. In her text on documentary storytelling, Canadian filmmaker Brett Story describes a popular story as featuring a, quote, "main character, 3 acts, heroic journey, climax, resolution. Nothing else seems to suffice in today's documentary marketplace. A good story reigns supreme," end quote. For Brett's Story, the impetus in storytelling to center one narrative, one arc, is to prioritize an easy empathy over a larger, more expansive solidarity. To condense the flux and mutability of life into one bounded piece of information is ultimately to jettison the often contradictory and messy realities of intersecting experiences and encounters. Because of this, restoring is open to far more than what Anglo-European academic ways and methods of knowing commonly allows for or is willing to recognize. Kaguru Makaria comments that, quote, "So much knowledge exists as songs and dances, as gossip and rumor, as barely decipherable markings on trees and stone floors, as disturbed earth and invasive plants. But yes, keep insisting knowledge is only credible as peer-reviewed articles and monographs," end quote. All this is to say is that restoring in kin studies can never be prescriptive. Following Indigenous legal scholar Val Napoleon, who draws on the Cree thinker Lewis Bird, we understand stories as good to think with. Thinking with stories allows us to move away from prescription. There is no particular prototype for how a story has to unfold. On the contrary, fish restoring is about letting the sounds guide us rather than placing expectations on what they might be or do. Without the neatness of prescription, the stories told through restoring are more directed to challenge, to question what is taken as knowledge and assertion, to model behavior, to invite multiplicity and to return to, rather than to find an endpoint for. We don't necessarily know what purpose these stories serve. or why they come to us, and this is a part of leaving the Western story form, which demands clarity. In this kind of restoring, opacity and untranslatability is welcomed. This also pushes against anthropomorphism, the tendency to want to make sense of or understand what is being told in a particular kind of human framework or temporality. In order to connect with these stories, we try to understand them as reminders of our specific responsibilities to being in good relation, which in a practical sense means working with people who are intimately tied to these watersheds, who have sat with these stories for far longer than us, through generations, who know these places well. They also help to remind us of the importance of seeking consent from water and fish, to ensure in whatever ways we are guided to that we remain attuned, and that we remain attuned to what is ours to hear and what is not. These practices of restoring through seeking consent, of trying to be in good relation, of listening to land, are all practices that non-Indigenous scholars are invited to attend to, whether in proximity or over vast distances. We see kin studies as an opportunity for non-Indigenous scholars to work in conjunction and alliance with literacies that are not ours to hold, to try to move without extraction, coercion, and assimilation. By beginning from a disposition of not knowing, by amplifying Indigenous and Black self-determination and self-representation, and taking direction from what specific communities and people are already doing and saying, there is a possibility for breaking apart the certainty that is birthed from Anglo-European forms of knowledge production. Beyond changing reading lists or citations, beyond rhetorical calls for decolonization or diversity, for academics this means taking very seriously what it means to approach ecological hotspots, whatever the method, through relation. In whatever way it is possible for each of us to encounter a place and the communities that inhabit it, we can actively choose to focus on the nuance and complexities of life. Kin studies requires a different formulation of scale, time, and place. It is not always possible to travel to conduct fieldwork, and we are very well aware of the discrimination that prohibits many younger, poorer, and more precarious, racialized, disabled, and otherwise minoritized scholars to access research mobility. The emblematic figure of the academic ethnographer as explorer is symbolic of the imperialism and colonialism on which our social sciences and humanities disciplines are based. With kin studies and practices of restoring, we see possibilities for trying to build good relation through archives, social media, online platforms, audiovisual documents, texts, poetry, and other ways of connecting. Physical presence on land does not mean attunement. Attunement here for us in our work in the Pacific and Canada is about always centering Indigenous and non-human autonomy, voices and practices from the movements for liberation that people themselves are unfolding. Being attuned means being honest about our own stakes and histories, what we are able to bring, and when it is best for us to leave things alone. It means placing our own bodies within our stories, as always contributing to the relations we are part of. From these standpoints, we can move toward restoring.
We know by now what happens when we don't listen to the fish. Wayne labored his entire adult life to protect the bull trout and raise the alarm about their decline, as did many of his friends and compatriots in the Alberta naturalist and ecology community. What went wrong after the calls of Wayne and his friends and colleagues to action was that the provincial and federal governments failed to listen, attune, and re-story as they plodded along the path set out for them by the linear logics of Western politics, science, and imagination. And again, I want to stress, it's not that the scientists working for the government didn't care, it's that the frameworks available to them are massively hampered by the governance paradigms of settler colonization. So this devastating delay in protecting bull trout over 4 subsequent decades, despite the evidence, is precisely why we call upon scientists, policymakers, politicians, and others to consider the way that they understand their responsibilities to the watersheds, homelands, and worlds they occupy as they engage with environments, ecologies, and habitats. Listening as a critical part of a process to action which activates the return of land and resources to Indigenous communities is different to the listening that we are generally taught to do. It requires us to always acknowledge and work with and from our own shifting positionalities and responsibilities. We must dismantle our own listening biases and tendencies and habits in order to be able to open up to the incommensurabilities that listening brings to us. To listen to the stories of the fish, to listen to fish, is to place our own attention into understanding the specificities of relations and places at the forefront of our work. It also means to think very carefully about places. It also means to think very carefully about who we are and how we encounter places, and how places might encounter us. There is no objectivity in this work. How we listen and what we listen to, what we are granted permission to hear, is always changing and contingent. We can never fix into one prescription or schema what listening is. The practices of attuning within kin studies as a movement away from the instrumentalization of place as a so-called environmental case study is, in our opinion, crucial to intervening in the often unthinking and conventional ways that academics prioritize certainty and knowing over a curiosity and openness to difference. So this is a call for us to come into a kind of relationship with place, with time, with human and more than human beings, and to really approach questions with a kind of humility, and to be open to the possibility that we don't know, but maybe the fish know some things that they're willing to share with us. So thank you.